welcome you to the official podcast of the Fish Wrapper publication, bringing you story content to inspire, encourage, and uplift the soul. It's our hope you find these stories refreshing, thought-provoking, and motivating as you face the challenges of everyday life. So turn us up and tune your ears, and let's get started by jumping right into the story.
The Buller Podington Pact by Frank Richard Stockton. Read by Michael D'Annunzio.
"I tell you, William," said Thomas Buller to his friend, Mr. Podington, "I am truly sorry about it, but I cannot arrange it for this year. Now, as to my invitation, that is very different."
"Of course it's different," was the reply. "But I am obliged to say, as I said before, that I really cannot accept it."
Remarks similar to these had been made by Thomas Buller and William Podington for at least once a year for some 5 years. They were old friends. They had been schoolboys together and had been associated in business since they were young men. They had now reached a vigorous middle age, and they were each married, and each had a house in the country in which he resided for a part of the year. They were warmly attached to each other, and each was the best friend which the other had in this world. But during all these years, neither of them had visited the other in his country home. The reason for this avoidance of each other at their respective rural residences may be briefly stated. Mr. Buller's country house was situated by the sea, and he was very fond of the water. He had a good catboat which he sailed himself with much judgment and skill, and it was his greatest pleasure to take his friends and visitors upon little excursions on the bay. But Mr. Podington was desperately afraid of the water, and he was particularly afraid of any craft sailed by an amateur. If his friend Buller would have employed a professional mariner of years and experience to steer and manage his boat, Podington might have been willing to take an occasional sail. But as Buller always insisted upon sailing his own boat, and took it ill if any of his visitors doubted his ability to do so properly, Podington did not wish to wound the self-love of his friend, and he did not wish to be drowned. Consequently, he could not bring himself to consent to go to Buller's house by the sea. To receive his good friend Buller at his own house in the beautiful upland region in which he lived would have been a great joy to Mr. Podington. But Buller could not be induced to visit him. Podington was very fond of horses and always drove himself, while Buller was more afraid of horses than he was of elephants or lions. To one or more horses driven by a coachman of years and experience, he did not always object, but to a horse driven by Podington, who had much experience and knowledge regarding mercantile affairs, but was merely an amateur horseman, he most decidedly and strongly objected. He did not wish to hurt his friend's feelings by refusing to go to drive with him, but he would not rack his own nervous system by accompanying him. Therefore, it was that he had not yet visited the beautiful upland country residence of Mr. Podington. At last, this state of things grew awkward. Mrs. Buller and Mrs. Podington, often with their families, visited each other at their country homes, but the fact that on these occasions they were never accompanied by their husbands caused more and more gossip among the neighbors, both in the upland country and by the sea. One day, in spring, as the two sat in their city office, where Mr. Podington had just repeated his annual invitation, his friend replied to him thus: "William, if I come to see you this summer, will you visit me? The thing is beginning to look a little ridiculous, and people are starting to talk about it." Mr. Podington put his hand to his brow and for a few moments closed his eyes. In his mind, he saw a catboat upon its side, the sails spread out over the water, and two men, almost entirely immersed in the waves, making efforts to reach the side of the boat. One of these was getting on very well. That was Buller. The other seemed to sink. His arms were uselessly waving in the air. That was himself. But he opened his eyes and looked bravely out of the window. It was time to conquer all of this. It was indeed growing ridiculous. Buller had been sailing many years and had never been upset. "Yes," he said,
I will do it. I'm ready any time you name.
Mr. Buller rose and stretched out his hand.
Good, he said. It is a compact.
Buller was the first to make the promised country visit. He did not mention the subject of horses to his friend, but he knew through Mrs. Buller that Podington still continued to be his own driver. She had informed him, however, that at present he was accustomed to driving a big black horse which, in her opinion, was as gentle and reliable as these animals ever became, and she could not imagine how anybody could be afraid of him. So when, the next morning after his arrival, Mr. Buller asked by his host if he would like to take a drive, he suppressed a certain rising emotion and said that it would please him very much. When the good black horse had jogged along a pleasant road for half an hour, Mr. Buller began to feel that perhaps, for all these years, he had been laboring under a misconception. It seemed to be possible that there were some horses to which surrounding circumstances in the shape of sights and sounds were so irrelevant that they were to a certain degree entirely safe, even when guided and controlled by an amateur hand. As they passed some meadowland, somebody behind a hedge fired a gun. Mr. Buller was frightened, but the horse was not.
William,
said Buller, looking cheerfully around him.
I had no idea that you lived in such a pretty country. In fact, I might almost call it beautiful. You have not any wide stretch of water, such as I like so much, but here's a pretty river. Those rolling hills are very charming, and beyond, you have the blue of the mountains.
It is lovely,
said his friend.
I never get tired of driving through this country. Of course, the seaside is very fine, but here we have such a variety of scenery.
Mr. Buller could not help thinking that sometimes the seaside was a little monotonous, and that he had lost a great deal of pleasure by not varying his summers by going up to spend a week or two with Podington.
William, he said, how long have you had this horse?
About 2 years,
said Mr. Podington.
Before I got him, I used to drive a pair.
Thought Buller,
how lucky I was not to come 2 years ago.
and his regrets for not sooner visiting his friend greatly decreased. Now they came to a place where the stream, by which the road ran, had been dammed for a mill, and had widened into a beautiful pond.
There now, cried Mr. Buller. That's what I like. William, you seem to have everything, and the reflections of the trees over there make a charming picture. You can't get that at the seaside, you know.
Mr. Podington was delighted. His face glowed. He was rejoicing at the pleasure of his friend.
I tell you, Thomas,
he said.
that...
William,
exclaimed Buller, with a sudden squirm in his seat.
What is that I hear? Is that a train?
Yes,
said Mr. Podington.
that is the 1040 up.
Does it come over here?
Asked Mr. Buller nervously.
Does it go over that bridge?
Yes,
said Podington.
but it can't hurt us, for the road goes under the bridge. We're perfectly safe. There is no risk of accident.
But your horse! Your horse!
Exclaimed Buller, as the train came nearer and nearer.
What will he do?
Do?
Said Podington.
He'll do what he's doing now. He doesn't mind trains.
But look here, William.
Exclaimed Buller.
It will get there just as we do. No horse could stand a roaring up in the air like that, Podington laughed.
He will not mind it in the least, he said.
Come now, cried Buller. Really, I can't stand this. Just stop a minute. William, let me get out. It sets all my nerves quivering.
Mr. Podington smiled with a superior smile.
Oh, you needn't get out,
He said.
there's not the least danger in the world. But I don't want to make you nervous. I will turn around and drive the other way.
But you can, screamed Buller. This road is not wide enough, and the train is nearly here. Please stop.
The imputation that the road was not wide enough for him to turn was too much for Podington to bear. He was very proud of his ability to turn a vehicle in a narrow place.
Turn?
He said,
That's the easiest thing in the world. See? A little to the right, then a back, then a sweep to the left, and we'll be going the other way.
and instantly he began the maneuver in which he was such an adept.
Oh, Thomas,
Cried Buller, half rising in his seat.
that train's almost here.
And we are almost...
Mr. Podington was about to say turned around, but he stopped. Mr. Buller's exclamations had made him a little nervous, and, in his anxiety to turn quickly, he had pulled upon his horse's bit with more energy than was actually necessary, and his nervousness was being communicated to the horse. That animal backed with such extraordinary vigor that the hind wheels of the wagon went over a bit of the grass by the road and into the water. The sudden jolt gave a new impetus for Mr. Buller's fears. "You'll upset!" he cried, and not thinking of what he was about, he laid hold of his friend's arm. The horse, startled by this sudden jerk upon its bit, which combined with the thundering of the train, which was now on the bridge, made him think that something extraordinary was about to happen, and gave a sudden and forcible start backward, so that not only the hind wheels of the light wagon, but the fore wheels and his own hind legs went into the water. As the bank at this spot sloped steeply, the wagon continued to go backward, despite the efforts of the agitated horse to find a footing on the crumbling edge of the bank. "Whoa!" cried Mr. Buller.
Get up!
Exclaimed Mr. Podington, applying his whip upon the plunging beast. But exclamations and castigations had no effect upon the horse. The original bed of the stream ran close to the road, and the bank was so steep and the earth so soft that it was impossible for the horse to advance or even maintain his footing. Back he went, until the whole equipage was in the water, and the wagon was afloat.
We hope you've been enjoying the story. We will continue in just a moment. We want to remind you that the Fish Wrapper is available by subscription. Each issue of the Fish Wrapper is jam-packed with story content, amazing recipes, games, jokes, and much, much more. Our readers never want to miss an issue. And you can order yours today by visiting www.thefishwrapperonline.com or by calling 717-400-FISH. That number again is 717-400-FISH. Now let's return and finish the story.
This vehicle was a road wagon without a top, and the joints of its box body were tight enough to prevent the water from immediately entering in. So, somewhat deeply sunken, it rested upon the water. The horse was now entirely immersed in the water, with the exception of his head and the upper part of his neck, and, unable to reach the bottom with his feet, he made vigorous efforts to swim. Mr. Podington, the reins and whip in his hands, sat horrified and pale. The accident was so sudden, he was so startled and so frightened, that for a moment he could not speak a word. Mr. Buller, on the other hand, was now lively and alert. The wagon had no sooner floated away from the shore than he felt himself at home. He was upon his favorite element. Water had no fears for him. He saw that his friend was nearly frightened out of his wits, and that, figuratively speaking, he must step to the helm and take charge of the vessel. He stood up and gazed about him. "Put her across the stream," he shouted. "She can't make headway against this current. Head her to that clump of trees on the other side. The bank is lower there, and we can beach her. Move a little the other way. We must trim boat. Now then, pull on your starboard rein." Podington obeyed, and the horse slightly changed his direction. "You see," said Buller, "it won't do to sail straight across, because the current would carry us down and land us below that spot." Mr. Podington said not a word. He expected every moment to see the horse sink into a watery grave. "It isn't so bad after all, is it, Podington? If we had a rudder and a bit of a sail, it would be a great help to the horse. This wagon is not a bad boat." The despairing Podington looked at his feet.
It's coming in,
He said in a husky voice.
Thomas. The water's over my shoes.
"That is so," said Buller. "I'm so used to water I didn't notice it. She leaks. Do you carry anything to bail her out with?"
Bail?
cried Podington, now finding his voice.
Oh, Thomas, we're sinking.
"That's so," said Buller. "She leaks like a sieve." The weight of the running gear and of the two men was entirely too much for the buoyancy of the wagon body. The water rapidly rose toward the top of its sides.
We're going to drown,
cried Podington, suddenly rising. "Lick him! Lick him!" exclaimed Buller. "Make him swim faster!"
There's nothing to lick,
cried Podington, vainly lashing at the water, for he could not reach the horse's head. The poor man was dreadfully frightened. He had never imagined it possible that he would be drowned in his own wagon. "What?" cried Buller, as the water rose over the sides. "Steady yourself, old boy, or you'll go overboard!" And the next moment the wagon body sunk out of sight. But it did not go down very far. The deepest part of the channel of the stream had been passed, and with a bump, the wheel struck the bottom. "You don't say!" exclaimed Buller. "We are aground!"
aground.
exclaimed Podington.
Indeed we are.
As the two men stood up in the submerged wagon, the water was above their knees, and when Podington looked out over the surface of the pond, now so near his face, it seemed like a sheet of water he had never seen before. It was something horrible, threatening to rise up and envelop him. He trembled so that he could scarcely keep his footing.
William,
said his companion.
you must sit down. If you don't, you'll tumble overboard and be drowned. There's nothing for you to hold to.
Sit down?
Said Podington, gazing blankly at the water around him.
I can't do that.
At this moment, the horse made a slight movement. Having touched the bottom after his efforts in swimming across the main bed of the stream, with a floating wagon in tow, he had stood for a few moments. His head and neck were well above water, and his back barely visible beneath the surface. Having recovered his breath, he now thought it was time to move on. At the first step of the horse, Mr. Podington began to totter. Instinctively, he clutched Buller.
Sit down, cried the latter, or you'll have us both overboard.
There was no help for it. Down sat Mr. Podington, and, as with a great splash he came heavily upon the sea, the water rose to his waist.
Oh,
He said.
Thomas, shout for help.
No use in doing that.
Replied Buller, still standing on his nautical legs.
I don't see anybody, and I don't see any boat. We'll get out all right. Just you stick tight to the thwart.
The what?
Feebly asked the other.
Oh, the seat, I mean. We can get to the shore all right if you can steer the horse straight. Head him more across the pond.
I can't heed him.
Cried Podington.
I've dropped the reins.
What?
Cried Mr. Buller.
That's bad. Can you steer him by shouting, gee and haw?
No,
Said Podington.
he isn't an ox, but perhaps I can stop him.
And with as much voice as he could summon, he called out,
Whoa!
And the horse stopped. If you can't steer him the other way,
said Buller.
we must get the reins. Lend me your whip.
I've dropped that too.
Said Podington.
There it floats.
Oh dear,
Said Buller.
I guess I'll have to dive for them.
Don't get out! Don't get out!
Exclaimed Podington.
You can reach over the dashboard.
And that's underwater.
Said Buller.
It will be the same thing as diving. But it's got to be done, and I'll try it. Don't you move now. I'm more used to water than you are.
Mr. Buller took off his hat and asked his friend to hold it. He thought of his watch and other contents of his pockets, but there was no place to put them, so he gave them no more consideration. Then, bravely getting on his knees in the water, he leaned over the dashboard, almost disappearing from sight. With his disengaged hand, Mr. Podington grasped the submerged coattails of his friend. In a few seconds, the upper part of Mr. Buller rose from the water. He was dripping and puffing, and Mr. Podington could not but think what a difference it made in the appearance of his friend to have his hair plastered close to his head.
I got a hold of one of them,
Said the sputtering Buller.
but it was fast to something. I couldn't get it loose.
Was it thick and wide?
Asked Podington.
Yes,
Was the answer.
it did seem so.
Oh, that was a trace.
Said Podington.
I don't want that. The reins are thinner and lighter.
Now I remember they are.
Said Buller.
I'll go down again.
Again, Mr. Buller leaned over the dashboard, and this time he remained down longer. And when he came up, he puffed and sputtered more than before.
Is this it?
He said, holding up a strip of wet leather.
Yes,
Said Podington.
you've got the reins.
We'll take them and steer. I would have found them sooner if his tail had not got into my eyes. That long tail's floating down there and spreading itself out like a fan. It tangled itself all around my head. It would have been much easier if he had been a bobtailed horse,
Now then,
Said Podington.
take your hat, Thomas, and I'll try to drive.
Mr. Buller put on his hat, which was the only dry thing about him, and the nervous Podington started the horse so suddenly that even the sea legs of Buller were surprised, and he came very near to going backward into the water, but recovering himself, he sat down.
I don't wonder why you did not like to do this, William,
He said.
Wet as I am, it's ghastly.
Encouraged by his master's voice, and by the feeling of the familiar hand upon his bit, the horse moved bravely on. But the bottom was very rough and uneven. Sometimes the wheels struck a large stone, terrifying Mr. Buller, who thought they were going to upset. And sometimes they sank into soft mud. Thus proceeding, they presented a strange sight. At first, Mr. Podington held his hands above the water as he drove, but he soon found this awkward and dropped them to their usual position, so that nothing was visible above the water but the head and neck of a horse, and the heads and shoulders of 2 men. To be continued.
We hope that you enjoyed this story and will join us again soon when we unravel another adventure from the pages of the Fish Wrapper. We encourage you to like and subscribe to this podcast, ensuring that you never miss a new episode. See you again soon, and may our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ guide you.